Hello and welcome to the webinar, Make Meaningful Progress via Remote Design Sprints. My name is Jim Callback. I'm the head of customer experience at Mural, and I'll be your host for today. You can follow us on Twitter at Mural and use the hashtags Remote Design and Remote Sprints for today. So please join us in the conversation on social media. Now, design sprints are great for bringing your team together and focusing on a single problem, and they help keep the momentum going or get the team unstuck. But what if your team doesn't have the time or budget for everyone to fly to the same location to run the design sprint? And that's what Joe Lally and Greg Smith from PwC are going to show us how to do a remote design sprint. Now, Joe's the head of product management and user experience at PwC. Thanks for joining us today, Joe.
Hey, Jim. Happy to be here.
And Greg Smith is the senior creative account manager at PwC. Great to have you, Greg.
Hey, Jim. Thanks.
And together they're going to show how their team broke the cycle of design sprints and getting momentum for their team, but doing it fully remote. Before I hand it over to them, just a few more quick details about the webinar. Again, follow us at Mural on Twitter, and you can join in the conversation there. If you have any questions for Joe or Greg during the session, please type that into the Q&A pane in your webinar software. If you look at your webinar software, one of the options should be labeled Q&A. If you have any questions directed towards the panel, type them there. We're going to take a pause in the middle of the session, and then again at the end, we're going to ask Joe and Greg some questions here. So type in all your questions, and we'll get to them, hopefully all of them before the end of the session. I'll be back at the end of the webinar. I'm also joined by my colleague Mark Tippin, who's going to help us do a little exercise there towards the end as well. But with that, I'd like to hand it over to Joe. So Joe, take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Jim. So just to get started, Greg and I are just going to share a little bit about our background to provide a little bit of context on sort of how we got to even talking about this topic. So I started the earlier part of my career working at a large media company, Viacom, where I worked on lots of mobile and digital products. And while I was there, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend the Stanford Design Thinking boot camp, the D-School boot camp. And it came at a great time for me personally because I was really, really excited about designing new products and the user experience around them. And lots of new things were happening. The iPhone, Facebook, Twitter, all these things were changing the landscape. And I was able to attend this program. And when I came back, it sort of connected a lot of dots for me, and we really started using a lot of design thinking related principles. We started even offering workshops there while I was employed there. I spent a good part of my career at Viacom, moved on from there, spent a couple of years working at World Wrestling Entertainment, WWE, where was able to build mobile games, mobile applications, lots of digital experiences, and launch a direct-to-consumer video product, WWE Network. Great time. Again, I was fortunate to be able to work with a lot of new and emerging products and technologies and experiences, and was able to apply a lot of user research and design thinking tactics all along the way, which I really, really am excited about. Moved from there and into the role that I am currently in within PwC, where we are essentially kind of an internal agency where we build and research and iterate on lots of digital experiences for different parts of PwC. And we employ a lot of design thinking related tactics just to do our jobs, just to create the experiences that we're looking to create. And one of the really exciting things that's happened more recently is that a lot of other teams have tapped us and asked if we would help them learn how to use design thinking, learn how to use design sprints, which we'll talk about today, to help with problems that they're facing. PwC is a huge organization, lots of different business units. So it's been a really exciting time for us where we have started to design and deliver single day or multi-day design thinking workshops. And more recently, we're building out design sprints to help teams approach problems that they're working on. Greg, I'll let you introduce yourself as you're a huge part of all of this. So let me turn it over to you before we keep going.
Sure. Thanks, Joe. So I've been at PwC for a couple of years at this point, but prior to that, I spent the majority of my career in digital development agencies. So really kind of building out various digital experiences. And so I was doing UX and UX design and design thinking before those were really the formal kinds of fields that they are today. When Joe and I met a couple of years ago here at PwC, he was coming in with a lot of this experience that he just mentioned, and I gravitated immediately towards that. So I've had the benefit and the pleasure of kind of being able to help kind of start this grassroots movement within the company to really bring a lot of these kind of innovative ways of thinking with design thinking and design sprints and all the kind of ancillary things around that to the company. So it's been a fun ride so far.
Great. Thanks, Greg. So I'm going to get into it, and just to sort of give a little context to the audience. So I'm going to speak about what we did to get prepared. I'll talk a little bit about what a design sprint is, some of the things that we used as kind of a checklist before we started. And then I'm going to go through quickly each day that we of our sprint, and something that was an advantage of being remote and something that was a disadvantage of being remote. And then I'm going to turn it over to Greg, who's going to get into a lot more detail on each of those things. So just to start, so what's a design sprint? So if you are familiar with the whole design sprint concept, it's been more recently kind of brought to the forefront based on the book Sprint by Jake Knapp. And we were reading this at the time, and it generally follows these steps. So on day one, you kind of map out your problem. So whatever your problem is. And during that, you're asking experts. So you're interviewing people who have some familiarity with the problem that you're exploring. Then you pick your target, you pick what you're going to focus on, and then you move into day two, where you kind of sketch a bunch of different ideas. So it's a quantity day. You're sketching lots of things. You move from there to day three, and you pick something, you decide. So there's a few steps to sort of get you to, well, what are we going to focus on? Once you've made that decision, then you move into prototyping. And in this case, you're prototyping something that's high fidelity, that can be interacted with, so that on day 5, you can test it. So we were, as Jim mentioned in the beginning, we were feeling like a lot of teams feel sometimes, where we were working on lots of different projects and making incremental progress on many of them, but in some cases feeling a little bit stuck. So we had this one project that we were really interested in getting unstuck, and just didn't have a good way to do it. So at the time, Sprint was sort of becoming a thing, and I proposed the idea to the team and said, hey, why don't we try this? Let's allocate 5 days and let's just focus on this. And of course, everybody was all in on the team. Greg put his hand up and asked if he could be the facilitator, which is a very tough and challenging role, as he will explain in a little bit. And we made the decision, and then we got started. So I'll talk a little bit about the process to get going. So the first thing we needed to do was decide, well, who would be on this sprint team? And in sort of traditional design sprints, it's recommended you have 7 or fewer participants. We had about that number that was sort of part of the core team, and we were all remote. So this was our challenge. We wanted to do this, but we couldn't travel. We couldn't be in the same location, so we had to figure it out another way. It was pretty obvious for us to choose the participants for this first one, because in many ways we just wanted to know if we could do it. Since then, we're now planning our next set of 3 more design sprints with different teams. And one of the things we found challenging is identifying, well, who will participate. So we've been doing it this way. So what I'm sharing on the screen now is just a mural board where we all work remotely. So when we're planning a design sprint, we will collaboratively gather input to figure out who could be a decider for a sprint, who could be a facilitator, who could be design experts, tech logistics experts, troublemakers. And we're sourcing all of this stuff on the fly, and then we're voting. And this has helped accelerate the process for us to plan who will participate in an upcoming sprint. So when we were doing this, the pros for us were travel didn't really matter, location didn't matter. Across our team, we have people who participated in this first sprint who are in New York, Florida, Nashville, and Uruguay. So we were kind of all over the place. So this was actually an advantage of being remote, is forming a team, because we didn't have to worry about who was in different locations. One thing that might be a disadvantage is time zone. So if you are planning to work with a team that might span across many, many hours, different time zones, that could be a challenge for us. We only had to deal with about an hour difference. So the first thing we did was form the team. This process went really quickly, and then we moved on to scheduling. So this I thought would be the most difficult part, and it was the most difficult thing initially, was just finding time. So in the sort of traditional sprint methodology, it's recommended to do 5 consecutive days, and it's mentioned to do a Monday through a Friday. When we started looking at this, we found that we couldn't actually find a Monday through Friday that worked for us. We used a tool called Doodle, which is just a calendar picking tool that just allows you to kind of pick which days you're available and let the rest of the team see it so that you can find something. So for our next sprint, we have found a couple of Monday through Fridays, and that's what you see here. But for this first one, we couldn't. So we actually opted for a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday. So we wrapped around a weekend, which I think being remote was an advantage because we could actually do that. We didn't have to worry about somebody having to fly into a city and then fly back or stay over a weekend. So it kind of opened up the possibilities. The thing to look out for, I think, is losing that momentum over that weekend. So for this case, we used this tool, we picked the dates that worked, and we scheduled. Then this is a step that I highly, highly recommend. Definitely don't skip this step if you're doing a remote sprint. Once we had sort of picked the team, picked the dates, assigned some of the roles, in particular, Greg being the facilitator, we went through a checklist meeting maybe a couple of weeks beforehand, and we looked at logistics and tools. So we didn't talk a whole lot about what we would do in the sprint. It was mostly this. So some kind of obvious things, but really important things. Have a good webcam. Really, really important. You're going to be on camera all day for 5 days. Have a good microphone and do a sound check every morning. Do a sound check after lunch. Really, really important to not let bad audio kind of get in the way. Dual monitor setup. Greg's going to talk a little more about this. Can't stress this enough because you're going to be in lots of different tools, and trying to manage all of that on one screen can be challenging. A quiet place to work from, really important. A cubicle in a group of other cubicles probably isn't going to be good. You need to be able to be focused and not have a lot of background noise. So wherever that is for you. A really good internet connection. You're going to be on video all day, so something that can handle that. And then wherever you are in your workspace, some sort of creative space, a table or a wall, because you will, and we did, do lots of physical sketching with just pencil and paper. And then some natural light. This seems like a silly one, but when you're staring at a computer screen all day long, having some natural light and a window to look out really does make a difference. Tools, so have a screen sharing tool. We happen to use Google Hangouts, which worked well and is just easy and we're familiar with. Some shared space to keep everything. We used Google Drive, but use whatever everybody has access to. A collaboration tool. So for this, we mostly used Mural. Mural was a key component to a lot of what we did. And then a communication tool. For us, we used Slack, but use whatever works for you. So these are some things that we just ran through in advance. Then I'm going to quickly go through the 5 days, and then we'll open it up for a few kind of midway questions, and then I'll turn it back to Greg. So on day 1, the goal is to map out the problem and pick your focus. This worked very well in one way remotely and not so well in other ways. So one of the goals of day 1 is to kind of map out what your long-term goal is for this product or project, and also to develop lots of sprint questions. So just lots of questions that you hope you can answer for a sprint. Doing this remotely and also doing this through Mural where you're typing was really fast. It felt very easy. We were able to organize our thoughts quickly and also pick the questions we were going to focus on. So generating lots of ideas worked really well. Voting, dot voting in particular works really well. What was a little more challenging was creating our map. So for us, what we did is we designated one person who would sort of be the map manager, and they took input from the rest of the team members. This is tough when you're remote because it's hard for that map maker to kind of interpret what people are saying. Ultimately, we got there, but I think this was one that was a little bit more challenging being remote. From there, we went to day 2, where we sketched competing ideas and solutions, And we, in particular, did lightning demos. So in the sprint process, the concept of a lightning demo is basically team members will research lots of other experiences that might be similar to the one that you're looking at, and then bring those and present them to the team. So this worked really well. We screen shared along the way, so whoever was presenting their competing idea would share their screen and talk through what they found interesting. And again, we designated one sketcher. And this was a key thing, I think, to keep in mind, is that the sketcher was armed with an iPad and a stylus, and they were using Mural loaded onto that iPad to hand sketch. So we sort of mimicked the way you might do this in person on a whiteboard or on paper. And this worked really well. So along the way, that sketcher was just sort of taking cues from what each person was presenting and dropping them onto this. So this part worked really well. Not really any cons for this one. I think being remote was almost as good as being in person. From there, we went to day 3. So at this point, it's Friday for us. So we turn ideas and solutions into a hypothesis. So a big component of day 3 is the critiques and reviews. So you end day 2 with a session where each team member individually sketches out some ideas based on everything that you've heard up to that point. And we did this individually. And for this, we actually turned to good old pencil and paper. And we sketched individually. We played lots of music, but we always remained in the screen share. And between day 2 and day 3, our facilitator, Greg, he gathered all of these. So we just took photos of them and we sent them to him. And then he created a mural board that would be our art museum, right? And you can see all of the sketches from the different team members here. And we did the reviews and the critiques, and one person captured notes. So you can see the Post-it notes up above each sketch. And then we voted. And this worked really well remotely. And I think the key reason was being remote, there's just something that sort of eliminates people kind of lobbying for their ideas and really kind of kept the process pure and clean, I thought. And the voting process, again, is sort of anonymous. So you really do allow the best ideas to shine. The second part of this exercise was storyboarding the different steps in the experience based on whatever was shown in these sketches. This part was challenging. So again, we designated a single person to be the sketcher, and her challenge was that she had to sort of, again, take input from people through a video chat, and it was a little bit tough to kind of interpret what people were saying. So this part, I think, was tougher. Certainly harder than being in the same room and pointing at a spot on a whiteboard and saying, oh, I mean that spot. So this part was a little bit tough. One big advantage, though, is that you can copy and paste sketches. So many of these were repeating screens or repeating frames, and our sketcher was able to just copy and paste many of those instead of having to redraw them each time the same way. So that was day 3. Then we moved into day 4, and day 4 is all about building a high fidelity prototype. So day 4, I think it took us a while to get going. And the reason was, I think we hadn't really settled on what tools we would use. And ultimately we settled on Google Slides as a place to sort of store all of the screens, and you can see those screens here. And we decided on InVision to take those screens individually and make them clickable so that they could be a functioning prototype for our user testing. This worked relatively well. I think there were certain challenges with maybe communicating with one team member who was working on one portion of the prototype and sort of being clear about what it was you were asking to have changed or updated. So this part was a little bit challenging. I think we really hit our stride about halfway through, and we were using Slack and Google Chat, and we were collaborating in Google Slides. And once we got going, I think it worked really well. And I think looking back at it, we probably would have used the same tools even if we were in person. So, so this was one that I think could work either way. From there, we went to day 5. So day 5, we had a functioning prototype, and we had scheduled in advance to test with real users. So for this, we used usertesting.com, which is a service where you can schedule a live conversation with a real user. And it looks a lot like what you're seeing right now, where you see me and you can see my screen. So I actually played the role of the interviewer on all of these. And the rest of the team watched as I interviewed these users, and they were able to see what I could see, where those users were interacting with the prototype we had created. So it worked really well. My recommendation here is make sure you've practiced your setup in advance. So ultimately what we wanted was to sort of recreate the one-way mirror effect for a user test. And the way we did this is we all remained in our Google Hangout, and I shared my screen, which represented the user interview, so that the rest of my team members could see what I was seeing, but the user didn't know the rest of the team was there. So while I was going through the interview and testing the prototype, the team members were capturing insights. So you can see that here. This is how we did it. We did 5 interviews, and for each interview, the team captured insights along the way through sticky notes in Mural. And then once we were done, we organized them into patterns, which you see on the right side. So we started to see a lot of similar patterns emerging. And this part, I think, worked probably as well as it would have if we had been in person. But the caveat is, I think it's really, really important to test that setup so you can kind of mirror that one-way mirror effect. So that got us through to day 5. And just like that, it was over. We had some great insights. We had learned a ton about the problem we were approaching. And we also were able to validate that, yes, I think we can do this remotely. Since then, we've scheduled 3 more sprints. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Our next one starts on Monday, so we're excited. And I'll pause there. And Jim, let's see if there's any questions along the way.
Yeah, we have a ton of questions. Thanks for that high-level overview. I'm gonna back up in the process.
Sure.
Because we had some questions from the very beginning. Let's see how many we can get through right here. First of all, just a quick comment from our friend Haley Temple. And she reminds us that time zones require empathy for your colleagues. Getting up late, early, celebrating their presence in different ways. How many time zones did you actually span when you did this?
We spanned 2 in this case, but it was only an hour difference, so it wasn't a big factor for us.
Right, and then you got to factor in meal times and you getting up and early or staying late, as Haley mentioned. As soon as you're doing anything between Europe and the U.S., for instance, your normal schedule of when you take a break and things like that is different for the folks who are not in your time zone.
Absolutely, yep, that's a big consideration.
Yeah, great. When I got a question from Martin about when you would do this, and do you do a sprint? 0. So looking at the overall development product lifecycle, when would you do a design sprint?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll tell you why we did this. So I mentioned before that we have been doing lots of design thinking workshops where it's very early in a project or very early in kind of the exploration of a problem. And what we've found in a lot of those one-day design thinking workshops is that teams come away with some pretty good ideas, but they're not sure really what to do next. So we looked at the design sprint as a great follow-up to those early design thinking workshops. So for us, we probably, depending on how far along people's thinking is around a particular problem area, we would either do a design thinking workshop that's a little bit further upstream, or a design sprint, which is a little further down. But that's the way we're looking at them now.
Okay, great. And follow up on that, Darcy asks about blind spots or assumptions. How did you pinpoint what you were going to then sprint on, assuming that the sprint kind of filled a gap in that process that you just mentioned? How did you pinpoint those blind spots or assumptions that you were trying to clear up?
Yeah, so we had them for sure. So Greg and I debated this a lot. So the problem we were approaching was a chat experience on our website. And the blind spot we had was that we were really struggling with the fact that we thought we already had the solution in mind, which oftentimes is a blind spot for these kinds of projects. So I think we recognized that, and we tried to peel back the problem to maybe just one layer up. So instead of saying we're going to be researching how chat might help somebody engage with our website, we said, how might we just help somebody engage with our website? So that was one way to do it. The other thing that I think was effective in this was the Ask the Experts section. So this wasn't a remote thing. This is more just about the sprint process. But we got people in and we spoke with them about either their experiences trying something like this in the past, or people who knew how these things worked, or people who had some just unique knowledge about user experiences in this area. I think it helped. Greg, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but I know we debated this a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say the Ask the Experts for sure. The other thing too is part of the process, once you've kind of figured out your long-term goal, is to identify sprint questions. And really what those are is the big hairy questions that you just don't know the answers to, and kind of in a lot of ways the roadblocks that stand between you and achieving that goal. So what are the things that we need to uncover? What are the things we need to better understand? What are the things we don't know? So I think that exercise of really kind of exploring the sprint questions is pretty helpful in helping you to identify a lot of those blind spots as well.
Yeah. Great. Just a couple more questions, I think, before we switch over to Greg, because we got a lot of great things here from the group. So thanks for all those questions. Terry asks, what the reason is, why did you designate one person to post all of the sketches and the photos, as opposed to allowing each member to do it? And I know you mentioned designating a person to do another task as well. Why did you do that?
Yeah. Greg, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. It's really just kind of a logistical thing with the sprint itself. So the idea is that nobody else other than the facilitator really sees all of the ideas until the beginning of day 3, because you want everybody coming in fresh and kind of, not having the opportunity to kind of pine over things beforehand. So that way I was able to control, nobody else seeing it by just taking it all from everybody and posting it on my own. So that's really why.
Okay, that's great. One thing that I've noticed with remote work in general, when you open up a mural, for instance, and just say, okay, everybody add sticky notes, that there's actually a hesitation there, because you don't get this natural differentiation of roles, who's in the foreground, who's in the background. So I actually recommend that you do, when you're working in a remote setting, that you do designate roles so people can have a little hat, an informal hat, but that people have, the scribe hat or the, collecting ideas hat and that kind of thing. Did you find yourself doing any of that kind of thing beyond what you just described, Greg?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And how, did that help then keep things moving along? One of the questions that we also got was around, how do you keep everybody's attention focused during the session?
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge and something that I'll talk about in my section. But yeah, it's I think a little bit more challenging. It's obviously difficult to commit 5 days in general, but when you're in front of your computer during those 5 days, it's a bit more challenging to really stay dedicated and diligent about focusing on the task.
Yeah, I think this is where, and this you would do either way if you were in person, this is where having a small size team is really important. I think a larger team is just harder to manage lots of people. So we had 7 people in our sprint, and that felt manageable, where, everybody had an opportunity to have input, but you could also kind of pay attention to everybody and make sure they were still engaged.
Yeah.
And our friend Lee Duncan from IBM just reminded us to time box things. Did you guys put timers on things?
Oh yeah. Time boxed everything.
Yeah. I find that creates a sense of urgency and actually keeps a remote team, or an in-person team for that matter, but particularly remote, this problem of multitasking or people getting distracted. If you time box things and they only have 2 minutes to complete an exercise, that will keep a remote team focused.
Absolutely. Yeah. Could not agree more.
Okay.
One other thing, Jim, that we did just to keep the energy up is, in a sprint, there are a lot of components where you're working individually on something. So sketching or generating ideas. We played music during all of those. And since then, we've moved to this kind of shared playlist model where the sprint team in advance will contribute to a playlist. And that, I think, really, really did help, because it just keeps your energy up and, keeps the team sort of connected through the music, I guess.
Yeah, a great recommendation. Something that we always say as well too. Basically, if you have more than a 5 minute or even just a couple minutes span, that silence is really, really silent. So you might want to play some music there. In fact, we have a playlist. I'm going to put it in the chat while Greg is talking. We have a shortcut to our playlist. I find that things without words and things that aren't necessarily highly recognizable are good because you want people focused on their task. So you don't want the latest hit or whatever, rattling around in people's minds. What kind of music did you guys actually play?
The criteria was sort of anything that was high energy.
Yeah.
We went with a lot of 80s music for some reason.
A lot of 80s music, yeah.
A lot of 80s music, okay. There you go.
And it was a shared playlist, so you learn a lot about the tastes and music of your sprint team members.
There you go. All right, Greg, let's finish up with some slides here and some more information. We'll come back and I got a ton of questions coming in. I don't got to remind folks to add their questions, but we'll take some more questions at the end.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about the things that worked well specific to conducting a sprint remotely and kind of what some of the challenges we had as well are. And Joe touched on some of these also. The first thing that I don't want to overlook is I think doing a sprint remotely makes it slightly easier to sell to stakeholders. Anybody who's ever tried to go out and sell a sprint to somebody and to, in particular, leadership, it can be challenging, right? Getting people to carve out 5 days is a big commitment. So you still have that, of course, but when you don't have to account for travel and you don't have to account for the budget related to travel, and you can do a lot of this remotely and do all of it remotely, it does make the sell a little bit easier. So I think that's something that is important about being able to conduct these remotely. Gives you a little bit more flexibility there. Voting and heat mapping are, and Joe touched on this, but those heat mapping is kind of a specific exercise that you do at one point in time during the sprint. It's essentially a form of voting, but the voting feature within Mural and just being able to kind of vote digitally in general, I think works a bit better than it does in person. And we see this a lot with the design workshops that we hold. When you've got a bunch of people standing along the wall looking at all the ideas, it's impossible not to sort of be swayed by what you see other people placing their votes on. So when you're able to do it remotely and everybody's just looking at their screen and putting their votes up and you don't really see the tally until the end, I think it keeps things a bit more honest. So that does work well, and in particular for the sprints, because you are doing quite a bit of voting and kind of contributing to the collective feedback there. The idea reviews and critiques. So that is, again, a specific section of the sprint. Joe showed the slide or the screenshot of that art museum where we had posted everybody's ideas. And what you do is you come in day 3 and the facilitator really just looks at each of those ideas and takes a minute or two and narrates them, right? So they're not my ideas. One of them is, of course, but most of them are not. But I still am going to go through and I'm going to narrate what I see, what jumps out at me. The rest of the team has the opportunity to call out questions and things like that. But very deliberately, the person who created that idea is not able to say anything until the very end, where they have the opportunity to kind of pipe up and talk about anything that they feel was missed. But kind of doing that all remotely seemed to work really well. I think it'd be a lot easier in person for whoever the creator of that idea was to sort of lobby for it or to, kind of speak up and say something. It seemed a little bit harder to do that remotely. So I think that worked really well. The ability to just keep things very, just very simplistic, right? As we go through these ideas and not have any sway in that. Sketching, Joe talked about this as well, but sketching worked really well. We used Mural. We had somebody with an iPad and the iOS version of the app and a stylus. And so they were kind of sketching at various points throughout the sprint. There was the lightning demo section, there was storyboarding, and there were just other sections where it made sense to kind of sketch something out. And that worked really, really well. And it was a very nice way to capture the ideas. And there was also a lot of time-saving features that you wouldn't necessarily have on a physical whiteboard. So for example, the copy and paste was huge when it came to the storyboarding. The storyboarding is a lot of, similar frames. So, here's what the initial page is going to look like. And then the user clicks this, and this is what it's going to look like. And so a lot of the elements within those pages are going to repeat. So we were able to just copy and paste within Mural, which is obviously not something you'd be able to do on a whiteboard. So that was really nice. And also the ability to use kind of mixed media within the storyboard and other areas as well. So as opposed to simply drawing on a whiteboard, we were able to drop in images, we were able to pull in icons, we were able to do things that saved us the need to draw something out and actually made it feel a little bit more high fidelity. So those were all really nice features that you would not get in a physical sprint. Excuse me. Prototyping. So as Joe mentioned, we used Google Slides to prototype, and then we output those slides and put them into InVision to kind of provide some of the clickability. But the collaboration within Google Slides in particular felt really really seamless, right? Because it was a shared environment like that. We were all able to go in there. We were all able to work on specific sections, co-create. And that just seemed to work very, very well. And I think even in a physical sprint, you'd probably still gravitate towards a digital prototype of some sort like that. But obviously we had no choice in this case. And so that worked well. And then collaboration, collaboration I have in some ways there, because I'm also going to talk about in other ways that it was a little bit of a challenge. But collaboration, I do think in certain ways was enhanced by being able to do this remotely and being able to really having to rely on the digital technology. So we use things like Slack. We've talked about Hangouts. We talked about Google Slides. We talked about Mural. We really just kind of leaned on a lot of the collaboration tools that are inherent in those tools itself. So whether it be chat features or screen share features, it was super easy to, when we were doing the lightning demos, just simply share your screen and take everybody else through whatever the particular product or service was, versus if you were in a physical location, everybody's going to probably have to like gather around one particular computer, or you're maybe going to have to project it on a screen. So it just seemed to really, the technology seemed to enable a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. So, Joe, could you go to the next slide? Awesome, thanks. So as far as what was challenging, so I mentioned collaboration, kind of a two-sided coin here. There were certain aspects of collaboration that I thought were a little bit more difficult. In particular, just kind of these open-ended conversations, which there are a lot in the course of the sprint, right? There's a ton of conversation and just open dialogue and throwing ideas around and responding to those. Certainly it's all a very structured process, but there's still going to be a lot of that conversation. And it's a little bit harder in some ways when you're doing it digitally. It's much easier to sort of talk over one another and misinterpret, the body language cues that you might otherwise see. So that's just going to be an inherent thing when you're doing anything digitally or virtually. But certainly with a sprint where there's a lot of that kind of conversation, that seemed to be a little bit of a challenge at times. Sketching, I mentioned on the previous slide, sketching worked really well. There were also things where it seemed like it could have potentially been easier physically. One of the things that jumps out at me is the storyboard, right? So I talked about the storyboard was great because you could copy and paste and you could use the mixed media, and those were all wonderful. But also the way that the storyboard works is you really have one individual that's in charge of doing the sketching, and everybody else on the team is kind of contributing to that, right? So they're saying, hey, let's do this thing here, or hey, move that thing here. That's a lot harder to convey virtually. So if you were in front of a whiteboard, I could just simply point and say, let's take this thing and do this with it. When you're just trying to convey that, with words, it's a lot harder to do. So it was a little clunky at times when you're really trying to be very specific about feedback and you've got 7 people that are all kind of collectively co-creating this singular thing that you're doing. So that's just something to be aware of as well. Another thing, I don't know if it's a good or a bad, but one of the interesting things about as we were creating the storyboards and the various kind of sketches, you can actually have multiple people in there doing it at the same time. So we did have, in some cases, the main scribe who was sketching everything out, but we had other people that were kind of in there going behind them and cleaning things up and maybe copying and pasting for them to try to take some work off their plate. I'm not sure if that made things easier or if it made things a little bit more difficult, but it was an interesting wrinkle that I think is going to be specific to doing this digitally. Facilitation and note-taking. So this is a bit more specific to the facilitator role, which was my role in this particular sprint. There's a lot that is on the facilitator in just a regular sprint, right? So you are, as the name implies, facilitating the sprint. You are paying attention to the time boxing. You are keeping things moving forward. You're identifying when the team is kind of at a roadblock and figuring out how to get past that. So there's just a lot of management of the team. There's also, and they call this out in the book, they say ABC, always be capturing, right? So there's a huge component of the role, which is capturing notes and making sure that any great ideas and things that come up are not lost. So if that were all the facilitator was doing, it'd be quite a bit of work. But when you're doing this remotely, there's also the added challenge of having to manage the slides and having to manage the various hangouts that you have going on, or video recording, sending around the links that everybody needs access to. There was just a lot of administrative stuff, let's call it, that wouldn't necessarily be there if you were all in the same room. So that's was able to be overcome, but it was certainly something I wasn't expecting from a facilitator standpoint. And then the last thing I would say is the user testing. So Joe mentioned that we used usertesting.com in their live conversations tool, and it was great because it allowed us to conduct these moderated sessions remotely. However, there was a whole lot of technology stacked on top of each other at that point in time, right? Joe was sharing his screen and he was dialed into that tool, and then we were all looking at his screen from our tools, and there was a lot that could have gone awry and could have broken down. There's just a whole lot of different things going on. So that thankfully didn't cause any issues, but certainly could have, right? If there was one chink in that armor somewhere, I could imagine that things would have could have gone a little sideways. But that would be kind of the one comment on the user testing. Whereas if you were doing it in person, where you were able to sit right beside the user and take them through things, obviously you're not going to have that. So thanks, Joe. So just some other observations, not necessarily positive or negative, but just some other things that were interesting coming out of the sprint. So I mentioned this earlier, focus is harder to maintain, right? It's always a challenge to get 5 people to just commit, or I'm sorry, 7 people to commit 5 days, no matter what. But it's one thing when everybody's in a room and your computers are closed and, off to the side, you have no choice but, to really focus. It's a lot harder when all of your things you're doing are on your computer, right? And there's the temptation to open your email real quick, or you've got your instant messaging client open, right? So it's a lot harder to really maintain that focus, and you've got to be very deliberate about it. And that's certainly something that's going to be unique to doing these kinds of things remotely. Dual screens, in my opinion, is a must. There was so much jumping back and forth between, different mural boards or screen sharing, different, things that we were trying to show, or in Google Slides or whatever the case was. And then we also had this persistent hangout up so that we could all talk. I don't know how you would, certainly you could, but it would be pretty tedious to be jumping between all those things on a single screen. So I think dual screens is a must for anybody who's going to participate in one of these remotely. This one maybe is obvious, but I think we discovered it was really important. Screen share capabilities are going to be really important. So whatever tool you use for, your video chat, you got to also make sure it has screen share capabilities. There's a lot of different points in time where being able to share your screen is very important. So when we do the Ask the Experts, and we're kind of talking to people who have some real expertise that's going to be valuable to us during the sprint, part of what you're going to do with them is share with them the artifacts that you've created up to that point. So what is the long-term goal? What is the map that you guys have created? What are the sprint questions you're trying to ask? And you're asking for them to kind of help fill in a lot of the blanks there. So being able to share your screen and show that kind of stuff is important. And then there's just a ton of times where, you are, as one of the participants in this sprint, wanting to show the team something, oh, hey, I found this really great live chat product that I think, we could learn something from. Let's take a look at that, right? So there's just a lot that really ends up depending on your ability to share your screen so others can see what's going on. So that's important. This one maybe is not super intuitive, but physical workspace accommodations are still really important. And I know Joe mentioned this as well. There are parts of the sprint that you're still going to do offline, in particular on day 3 when you're doing a lot of your sketches, that takes place offline. So you want to have an environment that's conducive to that, free of distractions. I work from home, and so you got to keep your distance from your kids if they're at home, right? There's a lot of things you want to kind of keep in mind, even though you're doing this remotely, that it's still important to kind of be able to put yourself in a good physical workspace. And then the last thing this was just kind of a revolutionary aha moment for me. I don't know if the rest of the team experienced this or not, but you know, I have developed, I realized over the years, a very bad habit of leaving my email open all day. And so I'm, you know, a slave to emails that are coming in. The sprint broke me of that habit, right? I had my email closed down all day. I would check it in the morning before the sprint got going. I would maybe jump back in over our lunch break and then maybe at the end of the day again. And being very deliberate about when I checked my mail as opposed to just responding whenever an email came in has, you know, I don't want to be too over the top, but it was almost life-changing, right? I mean, I've done it ever since now because it really helps me control my day, helps me be very deliberate about what I'm focused on, and allows me to focus on work as opposed to being really responsive. So, you know, that's a pro tip for anybody, whether or not you're going to run one of these design sprints. I think that's just been very hugely helpful for me.
Amen to that.
Yeah.
Me too.
Thanks so much for that, Greg. Let's do a quick demo here. I want to bring in my colleague, Mark Tippin, to do some of that sketching. So I'm going to switch screen sharing and I'm going to take over from you, Greg. Let's see, make sure I get the right window. There you go. So I'm showing a mural. You know, you were talking about sketching, and very often you can do some of that offline and take photos and bring them into a mural. I just wanted to highlight one capability of Mural, particularly with our iPad app, or in this case, Mark is going to be sketching using his Microsoft Surface Pro, which is a tablet that has a native app, a Windows 10 app. And there's Mark and his setup. So he's at home with a pen on his Microsoft Surface Pro. And we just wanted to show how this might work with a distributed team and having that designated sketcher. So Greg, I'll let you take it away.
Sure. Yeah. So I think what we're talked about doing here is just I'm going to ask Joe a couple of questions, and we're going to have Mark just kind of capture those as a little bit of a storyboard here. So, Joe, I know that you and I talked beforehand. I know you had a little bit of issue this morning getting your coffee. Is that right?
That's right. I was really looking forward to having a good cup of coffee this morning, and I went to the coffee machine on this floor, and it actually, when it's working, makes delicious coffee. But when I got to it, it had a notice pasted to it that said the coffee machine was out of order and a technician has been called.
Oh, that's the worst way to start your day.
Yeah.
And ironically, that is exactly what happened the first day of our sprint too, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, I happen to be in the same floor.
Yeah.
So maybe there's an issue with that coffee maker.
Yeah, I guess so. So what did you do? Did you go to another floor or just kind of suck it up?
I thought about going to another floor, but I also realized that I'm about a block away from my favorite external coffee shop. So I left the building and I took a walk over there.
Okay, that's very specific to New York. I would not be able to do that here. And how was it?
It was great. So it happened to be a little bit after kind of the morning rush. So I walked in and there was no line. And I was able to place my order very quickly and, load it up with some cinnamon and some goodies. And it all was very, very quick. And I actually, as I was walking out, was sort of happy that the coffee maker that I originally attempted to use was not working.
Yeah, silver lining, huh?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
There you go. Rubbing it into all your colleagues with your coffee there. Just wanted to kind of demonstrate a little bit of the designated sketcher aspect that you talked about. But I also wanted to highlight something that you mentioned, Greg, too, about always be capturing, right?
Mm-hmm.
One thing that I actually find an advantage of working remotely, particularly with a tool like Mural, is that everybody can be doing something. And I actually get nervous if I'm in a meeting or a generative session and I don't see people adding things to a mural. I mean, here at Mural, we use Mural all the time, and there's content coming in all the time, and it really reflects the richness of our conversations. That when you're working remotely, sometimes get funneled through conference call software, right? You're listening to one person talk, and then you respond, and it's almost a funnel. But I think when you have something like Mural and all those other tools you were talking about, Google Chats and things like that, you can actually flatten out that interaction and have everybody doing things at the same time. Is that what you found?
Yeah, agreed. It was definitely nice to have the team be able to kind of support that note taking. So, it took a little bit off the plate as the facilitator that we could have everybody collectively in a singular mural, kind of jotting down things that stuck out to them or that, they felt were important. So yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And I think, Jim, to your point before, calling that out, saying to the team members, hey, feel free to jump in and make sure people know that it's not just one person's job to do one thing. I think that helped us.
Sometimes I find that people are uncomfortable doing that, and that relates to another question that we got. I'm gonna skip down to some questions I have in the other part of this mural here, and that's about getting people comfortable with the tools. I think that that's one thing, getting people comfortable with the tools, but then the tools allow for this participation in a different way as well too. So how do you get them comfortable, kind of working together remotely as well too? So two-part question.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Joe.
Well, I'll mention the one activity we do, Greg, and then maybe you can tack onto that. So what we often do in advance of one of these sorts of sessions is we'll do kind of a problem exploration activity, and we'll do it in Mural. And it's kind of got two purposes. One, it's just to get people introduced to the tool, give them a little bit of the lay of the land so they understand how it would work. But it also gets people invested in the problem that we're going to explore for the sprint. So we will source a bunch of ideas all in sticky notes and then dot vote on those. So it helps people, once we actually go into the sprint, feel like, oh, I contributed to this and this was one of the things I voted for. So that's one of the things we often do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was going to say, because your question, Mark or Jim, was how do we get people comfortable kind of being able to talk to one another and disagree, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, there's the how to use the tools, but then how do you then get used to the mode of interaction? Yeah. So
yeah, gotcha. Yeah. So what I was going to say, and we actually didn't do this with our sprint that we did, but we've talked about it since, because we had the benefit with the first sprint we ran of all knowing each other, right? We were kind of doing it as a proof of concept essentially, but these upcoming sprints that we have are now going to be with teams that we have not necessarily worked with previously. And so you're going to have different personalities and people are going to come in with different expectations. So one of the things that we've kind of just decided is going to be a best practice for us is starting each day with some sort of a warm-up activity, right? Kind of I hate to use the cliche of an icebreaker, but essentially like a little icebreaker just to kind of get people in the mindset of thinking outside the box a little bit. And ultimately there's a lot of disagreement potentially that happens in these design sprints, because you're going to have a lot of competing ideas, and you want people to feel comfortable with one another and potentially with disagreeing with one another.
Fantastic. That's great. So thanks so much for that, Mark. Fantastic sketches there.
I'm loving this.
I'm going to move down. I have some questions here in the corner of my mural. Maybe we can go back up to Mark's sketch and see what he's done with it at the end. But I've been cutting and pasting some questions over here that I want to hit on. First, I want to start with Robert's question here, too, about the advantages of a remote design sprint. And Greg, you made some really great examples, and I just wanted to double click on that, some of the points that you made about how you pitched it and how you sold it, and that the fact that doing it remotely might have made that easier or harder. Can you talk more about that? How do you show the value of it overall?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that showing the value is tough, right? I mean, I think for anybody who's done these, it's much easier, but going to leadership who maybe is not familiar with the design sprint and asking for them or for members of their team to commit 5 days, it's certainly a challenge. I think it's really valuable that we've done this ourselves and we can kind of show what comes out of it. And Joe mentioned as well earlier that design thinking workshop is almost the gateway drug, right? You kind of get people to commit a day. They get exposed to design thinking and sort of the ability to just think in different ways. And a lot of times they'll come out of those with these loosely formed ideas that they're really excited about. But that can also be where things sort of just end up dying on the vine. So the design sprint's a really great add-on at that point, because you can say, hey, we've got something that can allow you to take that and really blow that out and explore it further and make a lot of progress in the course of 5 days. So it's definitely a challenge, and I would be lying if I said we've got it figured out exactly how you go out and sell it. But I think it's starting with something smaller is really helpful for people who are not familiar with what a design sprint is or what sort of that way of thinking is. I don't know, Joe, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, we did a debrief after we finished, and this was one of the biggest topics that we focused on was, well, how do we get people to care about doing this or interested in doing something like this? And where we kind of settled was we didn't think this is the kind of thing that could be very well represented through, a deck or, a slide presentation. So one of the things we wanted to do was this, to be honest, was to just get out there and tell the story a little bit, because I think for people to really understand it and see the value, they have to kind of feel it a bit. So that was one thing. And then the other thing, Greg wrote a short blog post to our internal website, our intranet, that is an easy, quick 5-minute read that we can send to people if they have any questions about it, that helps them get a little bit of the feeling for it. So I think, our main takeaway was we just have to figure out a way for people to sort of feel it versus just tell them what it is.
Yeah. That's great advice. Two last questions. I see we have about 2 or 3 minutes here left. Sam's asking here about a mixed remote sprint. Were you guys all remote, or did you have some people who were face to face?
We were all remote. Well, so for the most part, we were all remote. The core, we had a few of our development team who ended up kind of sitting together, but they were sort of like Ask the Experts kind of participants. But really we were all remote. And in fact, we had 2 people. I'm in New York, and one of the other team members is also in New York, and we intentionally did not sit together. Because I think sometimes when you have part of the team who's physically together, you can sort of have this break in communication. So we intentionally did not go to the same location. So we were all in separate spots.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that would be a really interesting question to see how you would do that if you were mixed, half and half, for instance. So maybe next time you guys do a sprint, you can come back and tell us about that experience.
Yeah. Well, we start Monday, so.
There you go. What about asynchronous work? Do you have to all be there at the same time? We talked about time zone problem, but we also talked about a whole bunch of digital tools that allow you to do more work either before or after. Did you guys take advantage of that?
We didn't. I don't know that you could get the same amount of value doing this stuff asynchronously. And I think one of the big things, and to take one example, we could have, for the user testing, I could have done that on my own and then put together a report and then share that with the rest of the team and told them what I learned. But there's no way they would have gotten the same takeaways from it. In fact, the developers who were part of the sprint, the quote that they said at the end of the whole thing was, "This is the best set of requirements I've ever gotten for a product," because they were there throughout it all and they experienced it all, they felt it all. So I don't recommend doing it asynchronously.
Okay, that's great. Joe and Greg, thanks so much for joining us and sharing this experience. I have a ton of questions here that unfortunately I'm not going to get to. I put a bunch of links in the chat. For those of you pay attention to the chat, I put some links in. We have a great blog post where Joe and Greg summarize, or actually give a little bit more detail, I should say. We have some of the screenshots there, so you can read a little bit more about Joe and Greg's story there. We're recording this session, and we're going to post it back up on our blog. So bookmark our blog. It's blog.mural.co, and we'll have the recording there. Joe and Greg, I'm assuming we can put the slides up on SlideShare or something and let folks have available to those. Yeah, I've got questions about that as well, too. I also wanted to point out we have a guide to facilitating remote workshops in general. I'm just going to switch tabs there, too. An ebook that we just brought out. It's mural.co/ebook. This isn't about design sprints per se, but it's got a lot of the general recommendations for working with remote teams in workshop settings. Some of the things we talked about here in this session. We also have some blog posts with other colleagues and partners who have done remote design sprints, and we'll send those around in a follow-up email. So again, Joe, Greg, thanks for joining us. I'm going to check back in on Mark and just. We're going to end.
I'm curious to see what
me too.
like.
Me too.
There's a supreme-looking cup of coffee in his hand.
There you go. It does have cinnamon in it, Mark.
I was going to say, it's got cinnamon.
Wow.
Look at that.
Yeah, that's their coffee goes to 11. It's the holy grail of coffees you found.
That's an accurate depiction.
Kind of looks like you too, Joe. All right, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks,
hey,
guys.
everybody. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but thanks everyone for joining. We'd love to keep this conversation going. This is such an important topic for us, and we hope you got a lot of value out of that. So with that, I'm going to end the webinar and wish everybody a good day. So thanks, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.